What so many people forget is that we are a nation born of an act of criminality, an act of treason. Now, a lot of people have heard charges such as that I myself am a traitor, that I have committed treason. In fact, I have committed no treason. I have not been charged with committing treason because treason is one of the few laws which is actually specifically written into our Constitution. It has a very particular definition which is not at all in line with my political activities. But when we talk about treason, when we talk about traitors, when we talk about what it means to have a citizen say something that is so offensive, whether it is the revelation of a secret or a declaration of independence, that they are cast out beyond the law, they are persecuted, killed if captured, exiled, or other things, we need to think about why. Now, in my case, for those who are not familiar with my personal background, I do feel an obligation to talk briefly about why it is that we're here tonight, why we're having this conversation. We're going to be talking about surveillance in our lives. This means we're going to be talking about power. Why? Because people are only interested in data, communications, surveillance, watching people for the utility that it provides. They don't do it for its own sake. Outside academia, there are not very many people who are looking at information for information's sake. Whether we're talking about Facebook, determining what ads you see, or something rather more concrete, information today is a convenient means. It's a mechanism for attaining a certain power. And that power today is control. Now, typically, in a democracy, our post-1776 democracy, control over the general outline of society is intended to be exercised by the people, with their will imposed upon powerful institutions, be they police, with their powers of detention, arrest, imprisonment, or even killing, or the military and spy agencies, or back into those powerful private entities, even corporations. But unfortunately, in that paradigm today, we have happened upon a problem. Surveillance technologies have outpaced democratic controls. A generation ago, surveillance was extremely expensive. There was a natural limitation imposed upon it. That is, the governments had to spend huge, extraordinary sums to track lone, isolated individuals. To know a particular person's location might involve many teams of officers, both in buildings and out on the streets, working in shifts. But today, that dynamic is reversed. One guy sitting in front of a monitor can track with precision an unimaginably large number of people. For the first time in human history, it's both technologically and financially feasible for governments to track and store nearly complete records of our private lives. Now, this is not science fiction. This is happening now. When we look at the construction of facilities such as this, the NSA's data center in Bluffdale, this was called by them the MDR, the Massive Data Repository. They called it that for a reason. This was not the targeted data repository. This was not something that was designed just to watch this person or that person. It's because they were ingesting everything, everywhere, and saving it in case it might be of interest later, in case something came up. Someone who previously there was no justification to watch, someone who had committed no crime, someone who was an ordinary person would have their life captured, crystallized, compressed, and stored perfectly, timelessly for 5 years or more, just in case they wanted to look at them. Now, the NSA, to their credit, interestingly, they thought this branding was a little bit problematic, and this was before I came forward. They thought, massive data repository, that doesn't really sound very good. Why don't we call it the mission data repository, the mission data center? And they did, they changed the name. That's what it is today. But this is representative of a much larger progression that should be alarming us, because, many people think that I have some grievance against the National Security Agency, particularly. Others who know even less about my history think I may be anti-American or against our government. I want to end all surveillance. I don't. I signed up for the US military, for the Army in 2004, when everyone else was protesting against it. I volunteered to work overseas undercover for the CIA. Then I worked for the NSA overseas. I came back and worked as a Dell contractor for the CIA. And then I went to Hawaii, again as an NSA contractor. I was drinking the Kool-Aid for a very long time, right? And this is not to say these people are doing bad things. There is no evil grand conspiracy amongst average NSA employees to burn down your rights, to destroy the fabric of our society. That's not what they're there for. But it's important to remember that good people can very easily do bad things for what they believe are good reasons. And this is what's happening today. Even in developed democracies, places that should know better, in the past few months, the United Kingdom passed the most extreme surveillance bill in the history of Western democracy, called the Investigatory Powers Bill. It takes everything the NSA was doing, institutionalizes it, and expands it to a level of intrusive detail that truly is beyond what we have seen the worst police states in history have within their authorities to go after. This is a law so authoritarian and so abusive that experts say it goes farther than laws like China and Russia, which I think we can all agree are no friend to civil liberties. Now, these problems don't only exist far away in other countries, and this is the central issue that we face in our modern times. In the lesson of these last few years, I would say, in democracy, in the United States, in our government, is that our government, like all governments, does not ask for permission before it acts. It deployed these capabilities, which the federal courts in the United States have said not only were unlawful for the entire history of their operation, more than a decade, not only that they had violated the rights of every man, woman, and child in the United States, but that they were likely unconstitutional, this is a direct quote, and Orwellian in scope. But they deployed these capabilities in secret, even when they knew in advance these programs were unlawful or unconstitutional, at least likely so, perhaps even because they knew this. And this effort succeeded for one particular reason. It was enabled because of failures in our intended mechanisms for congressional oversight. Courts that were unwilling to permit legal challenges. This would be in February of 2013, 4 months before I came forward. The Supreme Court had a case before it about precisely the mass surveillance that months later I would have revealed. Had the court ruled otherwise, my actions would not have been necessary. No one would have ever heard my name. But the Supreme Court said that although this case raises serious constitutional implications, although this could be a violation of Americans' rights, the government said it was classified. The White House, the administration, the executive, said the plaintiffs, this would be Amnesty International represented by the American Civil Liberties Union, could not prove that they were being spied on. And if you can't prove that it's happening, the courts said we have no role in the controversy. No matter how likely it is, no matter how problematic it would be if it were true, we have to blind ourselves to likelihood and instead confine ourselves to fact. And the government abused that. Now, perhaps this was okay, because we have a tripartite system of checks and balances in the United States. Of course, we have the legislature, we have the judiciary, we have the executive. What of the legislature? We had a Congress that knowingly permitted national security officials to brazenly lie to the public under oath without consequence or even correcting the record. This is a felony, mind you. The most senior intelligence official in the United States of America, General James Clapper, he's the director of national intelligence, was asked by Senator Ron Wyden, one of the good guys on surveillance oversight, if exactly this kind of theorized mass surveillance was occurring, if the NSA was in any way collecting records about millions of Americans, and it looked like this, testimony under oath.
Does the NSA collect any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans?
No, sir.
It does not.
Not wittingly. There are cases where they could inadvertently, perhaps, collect, but not wittingly.
Unfortunately, a few months later, after journalists finally had the truth of the matter in their hands, they found that that was not true. But this raises a more serious question of, does government lie?
Okay, technical geniuses. I know what everyone's thinking.
Forgive me, I suppose it wouldn't be fun if we didn't have technical difficulties.
Yeah.
If I could continue there, and I realize this is long, but we'll try to simplify this and get through it. It raises this central question, right? Of, okay, if we can't trust the statements of Congress that are made under oath, if we can't trust the courts to get to the truth of the matter, of the most extreme applications of national governmental force, who's really in charge of government? Are we, as we were intended to be, partner to government as citizens, or are we instead becoming once again something closer to subject to it? Are we losing our seat at the table of government? What do we do when the ordinary system of oversight breaks down? What happens when even the most well-designed systems of checks and balances fail comprehensively? I argue this is where we're forced to rely upon democracy's safeguard of last resort. This is the fourth estate, meaning our press, protected by the First Amendment, in alliance with whistleblowers, which are better known traditionally just as sources, journalistic sources. Unfortunately, we're seeing that the ability of journalists to operate free from interference, even in what are traditionally considered liberal and open societies, such as Canada and Australia, are coming under threat. We've seen within classified documents published by the GCHQ, which is the British version of the NSA and our closest sort of signals intelligence partner, that investigative journalists are considered a threat more serious than hackers, but one step less serious than terrorists. This should inevitably lead us to consider what kind of world we will be facing should governments and other powerful institutions, such as corporations, actually succeed in countering the threat of journalism that they are perceiving. What would it mean? If we only knew what governments wanted us to know, we wouldn't know very much at all. Think about it. Can you think of a case recently in which the government knowingly violated the law, whether domestic or international, and for fear of consequence, embarrassment, politics, or any other reason sought to conceal that fact from the public? Think about what we wouldn't know about having the lever of adversarial journalism. We don't have to be talking specifically about national security either. What about official footage, dash or body cameras from police shootings? But when we do go back, what about drone strikes and where they go wrong? Things get darker from there. We ran in this country an officially sanctioned program of torture That's the finding of our own Senate, right? Not a conspiracy theory, not some fringe news piece. But the Senate didn't make that program public out of the goodness of their hearts. They were not searching for accountability. That was a story that was first broken by journalists. And in fact, the only American ever to go to jail for the CIA torture program is the CIA worker who revealed it, confirmed it on national news, John Kiriakou. But let's look at it from the other side. Many argue that extraordinary powers, right, such as these, are necessary for protecting us or keeping us safe. They use reassuring political language. Perhaps this is true. But we should always be aware that we may not get to choose what it is that we're actually being protected from. Now, I would like to ask you about a particular story that's fairly well known here. This is written by a professor at Georgetown, Alvaro Bedoya, and he wrote about a famous case. Now, the FBI was investigating someone, a prominent religious leader, sort of cleric inside the United States. And the FBI said this guy was in contact with foreign radicals. He's possibly a threat. The Attorney General himself was briefed on the case, personally approved wiretaps, said, this is fine, this is what we should be doing, even though this was a US citizen, even though he was born here. He was placed on a watch list to be detained in the event of a national emergency to make sure he couldn't cause trouble. And of everybody the FBI was tracking at the time, the head of the FBI's domestic intelligence unit said he thought this guy was the most dangerous from the standpoint of national security. Do you recognize this case? That assessment that he was the greatest national security threat that we were facing, this was the person we needed to be protected from, was made 2 days after he gave the I Have a Dream speech. Now, of course, we have seen reforms since then. We had the Church Committee in 1975, which struck what we were told was a grand bargain. The executive would retain all of these powers, but we would get new courts, intrusive courts, that would rigorously scrub the activities of these agencies. We would get congressional oversight committees in both the House and the Senate who would see everything that was going on, who would never be lied to, who would never be misled, who could make sure that these things were rigorously overseen. And for a time it worked. But sometime, many decades, after things go on, people get comfortable. Things begin to change. We start to see things fail at the edges. Now the people who sit on those intelligence oversight committees get more than twice as much in terms of campaign contributions from people working for intelligence agencies, contractors, a private war-making industry, than does any other person in the Congress. They have incentives not to look too hard, not to look too closely. And this is not, again, to say the system can't work. This is not to say this is the end of the world. This is to say that we must always be skeptical. We must always recognize that it is the reflex, perhaps properly, perhaps improperly, of governments to conceal, to deceive, and mislead their publics because they think it's the right thing to do. They think it's for a good reason. And it is for this reason that we must reject from our vocabulary terms like national security. Anything that has the word homeland in it should make you a little bit nervous because they mean different things to politicians than they do to you. National security is what Martin Luther King was a threat to, right? These are euphemisms not for saving lives, but for political stability, for the continuity of the status quo, that are intended to popularize things that cannot be justified in plain language with common definitions. This is why they're looking for new words. And this is where I have to pivot. I apologize, we'll go a little bit long. But why this matters so much now. This is not just happening here, right? In Russia last year, they passed what they called an anti-terrorism package, the Eurovaya Paket. Russians call it the Big Brother law. And if Russians are calling surveillance law the Big Brother law, you know there's a problem. China is passing new intrusive surveillance bills that are modeled after the US's own bills very carefully so that the US cannot criticize them for using the same powers to abuse their citizens' rights. We are witnessing the construction of a world in which the most common political value is fear. From Washington to Moscow, from Beijing to Berlin, we are all too frequently hearing from the most powerful officials arguing that we are living in the midst of a period of unprecedented danger. Every day, some new threat, that the threats we face today are greater than ever, and therefore, things must change. We must depart from tradition. Since the turning of the millennium, the last decade, this has given rise to a creeping authoritarianism, a belief that the single most important factor in determining the direction of our society are the desires of our government, where the morality of a given thing has become less important than the simple lawfulness of it. This is a system called legalism. If it is legal, then it doesn't matter. That's the end of the conversation. Hard-won prohibitions from history are being overturned or ignored on the basis of nothing more than a claim that this has become necessary because these are dangerous times. After all, when you live in a world of terrorists and madmen, when every bad thing that happens on every corner of the earth is in your living room by the end of the day, a world where your nearest neighbor is potentially a foreign enemy, rights begin to look like a vulnerability. Ladies and gentlemen, I disagree. If our strategy to defend against each new threat is to do away with the very values that differentiated us from them, the right from the wrong, we have protected nothing, and we have won even less. We have diminished the constitutional principles upon which our governments were founded. We have truly completed that journey. We are no longer citizens, we are subjects. We must never forget, too, that at least in the United States, there are limits to what can be authorized by law. That is why we have a constitution. To say a simple statute is not enough. And what about when a law is passed, but the law itself should be disobeyed? The father of the idea of American civil disobedience, an American philosopher named Henry David Thoreau, argued that this is a duty that rests upon the shoulders of every individual. He said, it is not desirable to cultivate a respect for the law so much as for the right. The only obligation which I have a right to assume is to do at any time what I think right. Law on its own never made men a whit more just. And by means of their respect for that law, even the well-disposed are daily made agents of injustice. More simply, this is to say, the law is no substitute for conscience. Saying so does not make us anarchists. It makes us realists. Certainly, one need not look very, very far back in history to find examples of abuse, inhumanity, that were clearly, facially immoral. And yet, we would do well to remember that from the violent institutions of slavery, genocide, the disenfranchisement of women, to modern prohibitions as to who and how one can love another, these policies are more often than not entirely legal. I'm here to say tonight that the support of a majority can never transform a wrong into a right, and that dispossessing a minority of basic liberties, or perhaps entire populations of their privacy, does not become permissible, even if it is popular. What this means, ladies and gentlemen, although this may not be reassuring, although this may not be a comfortable idea, is that sometimes the only moral choice is to break the law. And while we face challenges, right, You all know better than I whose hands rest on the lever of power today. If reform is to be had, if progress is to be made once again, it will not be granted. It will not be given to us as a gift. Frederick Douglass said famously, "Power concedes nothing without a demand." It will be made in the face of resistance and abuse from the powerful and the privileged, because these are those who need rights the least. These are those who are impacted by abuses the least. They are sheltered not only from the consequences of their decisions, they're sheltered from our laws. They're sheltered from the necessity of rights. This is not a challenge that we asked for. Nobody woke up and said, please give me a problem to solve. But this is a challenge for our generation nonetheless. When you look at the news, when you look at the rhetoric that's being thrown around, when you see the rise of ultra-nationalism, racialized violence, discrimination, the abuse of minorities, the closing of our civil discourse, it's really easy to get worried, right? It's very easy to feel that things are slipping out of control. Perhaps there's nothing we can do, right? And to think, what is this going to do to me? What is this going to do to my friends? What is going to happen to the people who are sitting next to me in this auditorium, who don't have those same installations, who don't have those same privileges? But I'm here to say, don't be afraid. Because if there's one thing you can learn from me, whether you think I'm a good guy, whether you think I'm a bad guy, whether you think I am the worst person that's appeared throughout history, the lesson we can draw from this is that sometime, whether it comes to our courts, whether it comes to our Congress, whether it comes to our president, our White House, who signed into law reforms that he wants opposed because we had new facts, one voice is enough to change the world. And I think it should be yours. Thank you.